Did you know that Jesus called a woman a dog in Matthew 15? There's a much deeper spiritual truth underneath this interaction that many Christians unfortunately miss. See, this is not just a conversation about bread with a random Canaanite woman. This is one of the most controversial moments in Jesus' ministry, and you're about to see why. See, there's so much depth and treasure to dig up in this passage, but we need to recognize several key details that often get overlooked. That's why in this video, I'm going to walk you through 10 amazing insights that the Holy Spirit has showed me over the years about this passage, and I can't wait to show you. So let's jump in. Welcome to Above Reproach Ministries. I'm Jason Camacho. If you're new here, welcome. Hey, if you're wanting to learn how to study the Bible and understand the Word of God, this is the channel for you. We're in Matthew chapter 15. A few things before we get started. Like and subscribe if this content blesses you. Watch the rest of our Matthew series if you have not. Check the website every week for our complimentary, corresponding Bible reading plan. You'll see scriptures that cross-reference to this specific teaching in that plan. It varies every single week, so it updates from week to week. That's why I recommend you just go to the video description to download that. And then the last thing is on Thursday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have a follow-up kind of group study discussion together on our Discord server, so come and join us. We find ourselves in weird territory. Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region, we're in Gentile region, boys and girls. She came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he didn't answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away. She's crying out after us." They seem annoyed. So kind of what we see in Acts with Paul and the fortune teller who has a spirit of divination. And she can see things, and she goes, "These are messengers of the Most High God." And he finally goes, "Just come out of her." I think there's something similar going on here where they're perturbed a little bit. And he answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, got even closer. "Lord, help me." First it was "have mercy," now it's "help me." And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now, if you think that is offensive, I think your mind will change a bit by the end of this. And she said, "Yes, Lord." Does she go, "How dare you insult me? Who do you think?" No, she goes, "Yeah, I agree." So there's an analogy taking place here. There's some kind of image Jesus is using to convey something about this interaction, right? And she agrees with it, okay? She's not pushing back. She said, "Yes, Lord, even the dogs, though, they eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. I'll be honest, this one is probably going to be a bit longer because there is so much depth as I was studying this that just kept coming up. I never had seen most of this before. So back to verse 21. Jesus just got done talking about what defiles a person. Now he's in what would be considered to be defiled, unclean territory with primarily Gentiles in this region. Here's the first observation, is Gentile territory. See, Tyre and Sidon, we need to know Jesus is going into primarily Gentile territory, and I want us to have on our minds how God sent Elijah the prophet in the Old Testament. Elijah was sent away from Israel during the famine that King Ahab and Jezebel and all their adultery idolatry had brought upon the land. Elijah sent away from Israel to help a Gentile woman. In a similar way, that Jesus is seen withdrawing from the unbelieving Israelites, and he comes into this region. So there's so much parallel between those two stories that we probably aren't going to explore in this video. But he's going to find a woman of faith who coincidentally has a child that also has a need. Just like in Elijah's story, he's going to discover a woman who has her son and her about to die, and Elijah goes, "Hey, before you die, would you cook me one last meal?" It's an act of faith, okay? So this is what Jesus will reference, weirdly enough, in Luke 4. The reason I bring up Elijah is because Jesus himself makes this connection when he is in his hometown. He goes, look, you guys remember, right? There were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there's a great famine that came over the land. And Elijah, he wasn't sent to any of the widows in Israel. And already you can sense how tense this interaction would be. But Elijah was sent to none of them, only to Zarephath. And you're like, hey, in the land of Sidon, where is Jesus? In the district of Tyre and Sidon, or Sidon. And Elijah was only sent to a woman who happened to be a widow in that Gentile region. And then he makes the same point about Elisha. We're not trying to get in too deep into the weeds there, but Jesus himself compares his ministry in some ways to Elijah and Elisha, in the sense that God actually sends them away to people of faith outside of Israel. Jesus has already referenced Tyre and Sidon when using those famous cities to compare Israel with. In Matthew chapter 11, he says, guys, it's going to be better for Tyre and Sidon than for you guys. You know why? Because they probably would have repented long ago if I had done the mighty works there that I'm doing here. And so he's already made that comparison to say, look, there's greater judgment coming upon this generation than what came upon Sodom and Gomorrah or Tyre and Sidon. Okay, so these specific locations, geographical places, become iconic of judgment. So Tyre and Sidon were primarily Gentile, non-Jewish territories, if you're not familiar with the word, Gentile, non-Jewish, during the lifetime of Jesus in the first century. Even though they had a small Jewish population and long-standing trade and political ties with Israel, they were Phoenician port cities located along the Mediterranean coast in what is now modern-day Lebanon. So we're going to see with Matthew 14 through 16, I made this... I brought this to our attention 2 teachings ago when I said, look, once we enter into Matthew 14 into chapter 16, Matthew begins to emphasize bread quite a bit. And this section is no exception. There's going to be a lot of talk about bread and food. And the way it goes is Jesus feeds the 5,000. Then we get into the talk about what is allowed, eating with unwashed hands or eating with clean hands. And then Jesus talks about what comes into the mouth versus what goes out of the mouth. Then Jesus talks about bread falling off the table with this dog or this woman. And then we have the feeding of the 4,000. And so there's a lot of talk about food and bread. And then in chapter 16, Jesus goes, hey, you guys need to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And the disciples are like, oh my gosh, we forgot bread. Gosh darn it. And Jesus goes, no. I'm talking about the teaching, you knuckleheads. So the second observation, besides the Gentile territory, that kind of sets the scene, is seen in verse 22. Behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out. So she left wherever she is from, came out of there, which I think is already symbolic of something. But she's saying, have mercy on me. Oh Lord, my daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. It's interesting that she doesn't say, have mercy on my daughter. Now that's obviously implied within the statement here. Like clearly my daughter has an issue that I can't solve, but it would be having mercy on her. Here's the second observation. This title right here. Son of David. She identifies Jesus as the Son of David, which is fascinating, considering the history between Canaanites and Israelites in the land, but also considering how she seems to know this Jewish title for the Messiah that comes from the Hebrew Scriptures. Maybe just, she's heard rumors, it's been passed around, she's familiar with the lingo. So far, the only people who have referred to Jesus as the Son of David were the 2 blind men in chapter 9, and the crowds are wondering if, in chapter 12, if he's really the Son of David, and he casts out demons from a blind and mute man in that chapter. So there's only a few times so far when we've seen Jesus referred to as the Son of David so far. It's a very unique identification, and doesn't happen all that much in Matthew's gospel. So I think when we see that phrase, like, perk up, something's going on here. So when she asked Jesus to have mercy on her, we've already seen many people ask for the same thing. They're essentially going, would you show compassion on us by acting kindly for our good and answering our petition. It is so interesting that this is just an established fact for her as well. Like, she's convinced, like she knows so certainly, with such a measure of certainty, that she can leave her town or wherever she's from and she can come to Jesus. She's so certain, my daughter has a demon. And we might want to know, well, how does she know that? And if she's not an Israelite, where does she draw this concept from? Where does she get this understanding of being oppressed by a demon? What would that mean to her? This daughter is in a pit of her own. We referenced in verse 14, Jesus talking about the blind leading the blind, or all the way back in Matthew 12, there's a man with a shriveled hand who's compared to a sheep that has fallen into a pit. Or in Matthew 14, we saw Peter falling into the waters. He's going into a pit of his own. Jesus pulls him out and rescues him like the good shepherd he is. And now we have another individual who's in a pit of her own, but it's a Gentile. And she's in Gentile territory. So here's the third observation, is what's unclean and defiled. It's helpful to know, for those of us that might not be familiar, that this Canaanite woman is considered to be unclean. Ritually, ceremonially, she's considered to be defiled, in the sense that we saw in the previous section, or with the woman who has the issue of blood in chapter 9. In other words, both of these women, if we compare the woman here with the woman in chapter 9 who had the issue of blood and she touched Jesus' garment, both these women demonstrate persistent faith to reach out to God in the midst of what people have labeled them as. And people have decided, you're unclean, you're defiled. And they're convinced, yeah, but God is good. Even if we're considered to be unclean and unfit ceremonially for worship at the temple, God is still good. Like, it doesn't change their understanding or perspective about God is what people label them as. Now we get to verse 23. And Jesus, for some reason, remains silent, which seems rude, off-putting, something that doesn't seem to be fit for the character of Jesus. Like, that's not the good, loving shepherd I know. Technically, Jesus doesn't say no. Silence isn't no. And the disciples will tell Jesus to send her away. If you remember, they told Jesus to do the same thing to the crowds back in Matthew 14:15. I'll pull it up for you. It's getting late in a desolate place. The disciples come to him and they say, hey, this is a desolate place, like it's nighttime. Send the crowds away. Now, this is the second time they have told Jesus what to do, and it's to send someone away. But in that chapter with the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus goes, you feed them. What? Coincidentally, we're about to get a conversation about bread and Jesus feeding this woman when no one else will, and frankly, no one else can. So here's the fourth observation, is the ignoring of the woman. We should be asking, why does Jesus seem to give such a cold response to this woman? Compared to the last Gentile encounter he had, where it was very positive, in chapter 8, he had a centurion come up, and he was so impressed. He's like, yeah, man, I'll come to him. And the centurion goes, no. And Jesus goes, dang, you got faith. So I believe what's happening here is to draw out something that he knows is in this woman. That's why he's silent. And what he knows, I think, or suspects is in this woman, is supposed to make a statement to the disciples. Similar to what Jesus does in John chapter 4 with the Samaritan woman. So it's funny to note that Jesus ignores their suggestion, right? First, he doesn't answer her a word. And then the disciples go, hey, can you send her away? She's like totally crying out after us. And he goes, and he ignores their suggestion. And if we go back to verse 12, the disciples said something different about the Pharisees. Hey, Jesus, we just hope you know the Pharisees were offended when they heard what you said about what defiles a person. And the only reason I make that connection is because they care deeply about the Pharisees and their opinion. They care about the opinion of the religious elite, but they don't care so much about this poor woman of low status who doesn't have much to offer them, who's a Gentile, who's unclean. Once again, as we saw in the story where Jesus fed the 5,000, it's not about what others can offer the disciples. It's about what the disciples have in their hands to offer the people in service to God, or what Jesus has, or what Jesus can do with what the disciples bring him. Either way, they're so focused on, nothing to see here, and Jesus goes, I beg to differ. And he says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And we're going, yep, he did say that back in chapter 10. He's being consistent. But if you go back to chapter 10, there's this weird, I'll say initial inconsistency. Okay, it's not a contradiction, but it seems to be an inconsistency at first. Jesus says, look, I'm about to send you guys out. Only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, though. He's sending the disciples out into the cities to prepare the arrival of the Messiah, right? Being the traveling preacher Jesus was. And then, right after saying, don't go to the Gentiles, only to the house of Israel, he goes, hey, I need you to know, you're going to be dragged before governors and kings to bear witness before the Gentiles. You just said we shouldn't really go to the Gentiles. You said, go nowhere among the Gentiles, only Israel. Now you're concerned with us bearing witness to the Gentiles? Now, there can be a few ways to explain that, but I think on some level there seems to be, from the disciples' perspective, some mixed messaging going on. Right, we saw back in chapter 8, Jesus honored the request of a Gentile centurion. Again, had faith, great. Something else is happening here, though. And we'll bring it back to the centurion at the end of this. We'll wrap it all up neatly. But Jesus said, I only came to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Once again, using shepherding language, just like he did in verse 15, right here, where he's like, hey, or 14, if the blind lead the blind, they'll both fall into a pit. Like they're blind guides. These shepherds over Israel right now, they're just blind, okay? Jesus is saying, I'm the good shepherd, and I've come for Israel. It's as though Jesus is saying, hey, Israel is such a mess, and I've come to make things right with Israel first in order to be a blessing to the Gentiles. But along the way, as he's dealing with his own people, he still has time for the Gentiles who have faith, like this woman, like the centurion. And this is not anything new. This has always been the heart of God all throughout the Old Testament. God has no favorites. God is not racist. God doesn't show partiality based off ethnicity. He made a promise to Abraham. His descendants are still beneficiaries on a physical, material level. But if you're of spiritual Abraham, then you benefit from the promises that God made in the covenant. And so some people want to make Jesus out to be doing something very exceptional here. Like, he never does this. This has always been the heart of God. It's for all people. We're going to see this woman is very persistent. And she comes and kneels before him again. And now she's like stretching herself out before Jesus. Like she's, not letting him cross. You're not getting past me, Lord, help me. And he goes, it's not right to take the children's bread. And we'll get to that. But I want you to see her persistence. She came and knelt. She took a lower posture. She wasn't knelt before. And this is exactly what his people were told to do back in Matthew chapter 7. Jesus already told his disciples, weirdly enough, don't give dogs what is holy. We'll touch that in a minute. But he says, ask, it will be given. Seek, and you'll find. Knock, and it will be open. You should be persistent in your requests and your prayers. You should have a sense of like, I'm going to keep doing this until I get an answer, until God says no or not yet. And in Matthew 7, like what I just showed you, coincidentally, we see Jesus saying not to throw what is holy to dogs. And then right after that, he invites this exact kind of persistence in prayer, to ask, to seek, to knock, to believe the creator of the universe is good. He gives good gifts according to his will. And now we get to what many people want to be some kind of offensive statement, an insult, demeaning. Jesus is making a mistake. The woman stands her ground. Not so. It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Jesus is using dogs and bread symbolically to represent something. She agrees. I agree with that statement. She's tracking with him. But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Now, the bread here Jesus is referring to is healing and deliverance. That's what she wants. Other places in Matthew, we've seen Jesus use bread to represent God's word. Or in John's gospel, it represents God's life. So it can represent a number of things depending on the context. Maybe you didn't know this, but we create all of these free resources to supplement your faith and to strengthen Christian communities around the world. If you're looking for biblical content to use for discussion in your groups, churches, or one-on-one discipleship, consider using my book Fruitful, or any of our different Bible series playlists, or track with us through our current study. Maybe even consider starting an ARM discussion group, which we actually have a weekly men's Bible study here in Spartanburg, South Carolina, if you live nearby to join. And we also have a deeper Bible study discussion every week on our Discord server. Check the Discord event schedule for the time and day. You can find all this info on AboveReproachMinistry.com, as well as on our weekly email. So join the email list to stay updated every single week, and let's get back to the video. Hey, did you know that this entire ministry runs off the support of people like you? All of our free resources, teachings, and classes are made possible by viewers like you. So if you believe in what God is doing through this ministry and you want to help us in our mission, please consider partnering with us financially. You can give a one-time gift or become a monthly partner on our website. Our mission is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. And when you become a monthly supporter, you get access to exclusive content, special resources, and other perks coming soon. Visit AboveReproachMinistry.com/donate to give however the Lord leads you. We have many other projects that we're working on that need to be funded. A mobile app for all of our courses and teachings, and other Bible courses that are in the works right now. So thank you so much for all your support and prayers. Let's get back to the video. But here's the fifth observation, the sending her away. Remember the disciples, they said, hey, can you send her away? That would be great. Okay, we're going to come back to this. When Jesus says it's not right to give bread to the dogs, this is what we see the Pharisees and scribes pretty much tell Jesus earlier, that it's not right for the disciples to eat with unwashed hands. Okay, cool. Yet Jesus says it is permissible. Like, it's not a big deal. Just as he's about to make an allowance for this woman here. Speaking of allowance, if you notice, again, the disciples said, send her away. Same language. And I followed this rabbit trail as far as I could. I thought, let me sniff this out and see if there's anything here. In Matthew 19:7, I forget who it is here. The Pharisees come up. They're testing Jesus, right? And they go, hey, is it lawful to divorce anyone's wife for any cause? Jesus answers, and they said, well, how come Moses commanded one to give a certificate of divorce to, there's our phrase, to send her away? And I thought, okay, maybe there's something to this. This is about Moses. What does Moses command? Why did he do this? He said there's an allowance. Here's a certificate that allows you to send your wife away quietly, allowing a man to do this. When Jesus says it's not the ideal, right? What God has joined together, let not man separate. That's not cool, all right? And they're like, well, why is there an allowance? They're pushing back. And when Jesus says this is not the ideal because man and woman are one, it's as though Moses and the law, if I wrap up Moses and law, say that's one person, it's as if Moses is saying, send the Canaanite away. They have no share here in the promised land. Joshua was sent in to remove the Canaanites. It's a conquest. Kick them out. They had their chance time after time, number of years. God had mercy. Not anymore. Time to bring judgment. Okay, wipe out the Canaanites. Send them away. They have no share here with Israel. Jesus flips that. He says, no. Not to say Jesus contradicts God. He's God in the flesh. But we see the progressive revelation of God and the story of redemption unfolding in both testaments. And so at that time, something different is happening, if I can talk. Here, Jesus doesn't say, send her away. He says, embrace the Canaanite woman. Because he's going to say, great is your faith. Like, let it be done for you as you desire. And I want us to think about how Moses says, yes, send wife away. Here's a certificate. They could find a way to just get rid of the Canaanite here. And just, this is all about like kind of what's permissible at this point. Not necessarily what's useful, good, and helpful, but what's permissible. Well, Jesus said it's ideal for a man and woman to, when they're one, like man can't separate what God has united. And in Ephesians chapter 5, Paul draws on that to say the mystery of marriage actually represents something. He says this mystery of marriage is profound, and it actually refers to Christ and the church, which is exactly what we see in Ephesians 2:15. And you're like, why are you jumping around all over the place? I'm tied together, just trying to lay out the different pieces. Ephesians 2:15, it says, Jesus is our peace. I'm going to unhighlight this so it's not all confusing. Jesus is our peace. He has made us both into one. Remember that language of man and woman becoming one? Let not man separate what God has brought together. Ephesians 5 tells us, marriage and that mystery represents Christ and his church. Well, in Ephesians 2, we're told Jew and Gentile become one because Jesus is our peace and he makes us one. He's broken down the dividing wall by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances. Remember, Moses commanded she should be sent away. Well, Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two and making peace. So now it's not man and woman marriage. It's not just Jesus and church marriage. It's Jew and Gentile to be the church that is one with Jesus in this marriage context. The reason I lay all this out is because that is exactly what Jesus is doing in Matthew 15. Rather than sending her away, you might say, as Moses would declare with a certificate of divorce, get out of here, you have no share here, we don't want you here, Canaanite, you had some problems with Israel in the past, we don't want you. Jesus goes, He embraces the Gentile, the unclean, the defiled, the historically rejected, to make a statement about, I think, what he's come to really do. Here's the sixth observation. I mean, if you follow that line of thought of certificate of divorce and marriage and Jew and Gentile and faith can be, a Jew and Gentile can both have faith, like you kind of arrive at this point where, Jesus is demonstrating that faith can be found in Israel and outside of Israel. And here's the sixth observation, is there's a new Joshua conquest happening. I want us to briefly consider the history between Israel and the Canaanites. Right, the Canaanites they occupied the promised land before God gave it to Israel. And Jesus' name in Hebrew, Yeshua, just like Joshua, Yehoshua in the Old Testament, essentially their name in Hebrew is going to be the same. Joshua in the Old Testament faces the Canaanites and removes them from the land. He kicks them out. That's what the conquests were. He establishes Israel. God establishes Israel through the leadership of Joshua. And Israel replaces the Canaanites in the land, okay? Jesus seems to bring an inversion of this as the new Joshua, bringing us into the better promised land and bringing a better salvation and dealing with the real enemies. And he's the new Joshua facing the Canaanites, but this time it's not with a sword. It's with grace. It's with the word of God, and it's offering the same life and bread that Israel is offered. Jesus is making no distinction. Initially, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. True. But the leftovers? Jesus answers this woman by saying it's not right to take Israel's nourishing word and blessings and healing and deliverance and then just throw it to unclean individuals who historically have been enemies of Israel. It seems like a waste, right? And she actually agrees with this metaphor about dogs by saying, you know what? I'm a Gentile. I'm technically ceremonially unclean, unfit for worship at the temple and all the blessings the nation of Israel has under Yahweh. Like, I get that. And she identifies that issue rather than excusing it or dismissing it or being offended by it, right? She could have been. But here's the seventh observation as we wrap this thing up, is the bread isn't for dogs. The idea of the Canaanite woman asking for bread brings us back to Matthew 6. Jesus says, hey, and I brought this up earlier. Matthew 7:6. When Jesus says right here, hey, don't give dogs what is holy. That being the bread that is set apart for the Israelite nation. Healing, deliverance, life, blessing, all that the nation of Israel was exclusively granted. Not to the exclusion of the Gentiles, but actually to attract the Gentiles and shine God's light to the Gentiles so that they would want in and see the need for that. Paul reverses that, and now it's the Jews being jealous of the Gentiles. But nonetheless, Jesus says, don't waste what is holy and sacred on, frankly, unclean animals that will just turn violently toward you. And it seems as though he's breaking his own rule right here. It's not right. And she goes, yes, Lord. But hey. And he goes, you know what? And some people have said Jesus corrects his stance and goes, I was wrong. I beg to differ. And I'll explain why, if I can bring this back around. The woman pretty much says, I'll eat anything that is left over that Israel doesn't want. That's what the crumbs that fall from the master's table represent. And remember, just a few verses ago, we saw right here, after all of Israel ate and were satisfied, you know what we have? 12 baskets full of broken pieces, breadcrumbs, that are left over. For who? Well, that's where the feeding of the 4,000 comes into play. Almost to symbolically tell us, hey, there's enough of God and his life even for the Gentiles. It's not just for national Israel. She's saying even the crumbs and leftovers are enough for me. I don't need it freshly baked out of the oven. Just whatever they don't want, just what falls out of their mouth, anything. Her admission and agreement with Jesus' metaphor about dogs reveals her heart. Her confession and her words reveal something deeper about her heart condition that's not always apparent outwardly in her flesh. And this gets back into the conversation we had earlier about outwardly versus inwardly defilement, right? Well, you're defiled outwardly. The issue is the heart, though. So here we see an outwardly unclean woman, but inwardly she has the faith that makes a heart clean in God's sight. Her faith is what made her one of the children that gets to eat bread from the table. I don't know if she is still identified as a dog in the metaphor, or if she's kind of pulling on this to go, dogs can still enjoy the crumbs, and by making that admission, we're seeing, hey, I think she's actually one of the children. She's been mislabeled and misidentified. Outwardly, defiled, unclean, Jesus is right, Gentile, pagan, have no share the way national Israel does. Of course, you can be a proselyte and stuff, but as we'll see Paul talk about later, he talks about true spiritual Israel, true descendants of Abraham being those who have faith. Not just outwardly, not just physical, but those of faith. And if she has faith and Jesus goes, great is your faith, guess what? I think on some level she's being identified as not just a dog. Outwardly, sure. Inwardly, though, one of the children of God who are of faith. Now, maybe that's a stretch and you disagree. It's fine. But here's the eighth observation, is the eating with sinners. And once this hit me, I went, oh my gosh, yeah, he's already done this. She identifies Jesus, I think, as the master of the table, who gets to decide who gets to feast at the table and who doesn't. And this is where we have to remember in the Old Testament. Go read the story on your own. There's a prophet named Elisha. Elisha is being hunted down by the Syrian king because essentially Elisha is giving away his battle plans. And Syria is at war with Israel. Elisha represents Israel and is in their favor. So the king of Syria sends his armies to surround the city Elisha's in. Elisha wakes up, finds himself surrounded. His servant's freaking out, and God opens the servant's eyes, and they see angels around them. And Elisha blinds the Syrian armies. He leads them right into Israelite territory, where the Israelite king and his army could just kill them right there. And they go, the king of Israel goes, should we kill him? And Elisha goes, no. Hold a feast for your enemies, your unclean, defiled, violent, murderous enemies. You want Israel to feast with unclean Gentile sinners and murderers? That's in 2 Kings 6. So what Jesus is pretty much inviting the woman into is nothing new. Similar to how Jesus is accused of eating with sinners back in chapter 8, remember? Or in Matthew 8, we see the faith of the centurion. I told you I'd bring it back to this. I didn't forget. There's a few things I forget along the way. This is not one of them. Matthew 8:11, right after seeing the Gentiles' faith, I haven't found faith like this in Israel. This is one of the only 2 times. This guy and the Canaanite woman who Jesus says, I'm so impressed with your faith. And they're Gentiles. And in this context, with the Gentile centurion, he goes, hey, many are going to come from east and west. So not just Israelites, and recline at the table, feast, enjoy food with the patriarchs in the kingdom of heaven. You're telling me Gentiles are going to be there to feast in the presence of God with the patriarchs of Israel? They're not Israelites. Well, depends on what you mean. Spiritual Israel? Sure. National Israel? No. Of course, a Gentile is not ethnically Israelite. God has always invited unworthy individuals to feast at his table. I think of King David and Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was either the nephew of Saul or the grandson of Saul. I forget. I think a grandson. And he's crippled, and so eating at the king's table. But either way, if they should accept the invitation, as we'll see in Matthew 22 with the parable of the wedding feast, the king saying, come and feast, come and enjoy, come and here are the invitations. I've prepared it all. If they accept the invitation, even if they're Gentiles, technically, Jesus here is feeding someone who has unclean hands. Back in verse 20, what was the accusation? Or back in verse 2, Pharisees go, why do your disciples eat with unwashed hands? They break the tradition of elders. Verse 20, Jesus goes, eating with unwashed hands doesn't defile anyone. And then he's going to really hammer that home by feeding someone, spiritually speaking, who has unclean hands. When the Pharisees accused his disciples of doing something wrong by eating with unwashed hands, we have to remember that technically Jesus just fed people in a desolate place, multiplied food, and probably there wasn't any water readily available for them to wash their hands. We can speculate, but it's not likely. It's highly likely that many of those people ate with unwashed hands. So on both sides of this conversation about defilement and unwashed hands, Jesus seems to be doing that. And he tells this woman, great is your faith, which again, we've only seen that idea one time in chapter 8 with the centurion. And I love that this woman shows the persistency and the faith of the widow. In Luke's gospel, Jesus gives a parable about a widow who goes before a judge. You can go read that. And the point's about persistency in prayer, believing God is just and he'll answer and come through. Well, this woman demonstrates that. And I want to make sure we understand, she didn't change Jesus' mind. Jesus is the one inviting her to kind of push back against this Israelite narrative that technically is true, but on the other side, in New Covenant, when it comes to the things of the kingdom, really doesn't matter. And that's the outward, physical, ritual defilement of unwashed hands and such. So here's the second to last observation. I know this is longer. There's just a lot to say. Pure heart and unwashed hands. I think some people want to see this woman right here as some kind of exception, where Jesus is like, you know what, I'm going to make a special exception for this Gentile that he technically wasn't allowed to, and this is a rare occasion, but I'd like to suggest she's actually not an exception. She's of faith. She has the true heart of a spiritual Israelite, a child of God, a true spiritual descendant of Abraham. So it's not about the state of her hands being unclean or her ethnicity and unclean outward condition or any other outward characteristic and metric. It's about her heart. It's not that she's changing Jesus' mind. It's that her confession and persistence is revealing what has always been there in the heart, and Jesus is pulling that out. And I think this is more for the disciples to see. Because once again, they said, send her away. And Jesus could have said, you feed her. But he went, I want to demonstrate for you guys why this is not the answer to Gentile sinners. They're just as in need of the bread from heaven as any Israelite is. This has been the critique of Jesus for the religious leaders since Matthew 9:13, where he talks about God wants mercy. God cares about the heart, not mindless sacrifice with the hands, which is what we saw in the previous story about, well, I'm washing my hands. Yeah, but your hearts are wicked, man. In chapter 25, Jesus will say, you guys spend so much time washing the outside, but inwardly you're filthy, man. You're defiled. This woman is the inverted image of that. Inwardly clean, outwardly ceremonially unclean. So this woman doesn't fit into the category of the people Jesus described in verse 8 and 9. If you remember, verse 8 and 9, he goes, this people honors me with their lips. Their heart is far from me. Just about outward appearance and behavior. This woman doesn't fit into that category. She's not engaging in mindless sacrifice. Here's the last observation, is instant healing. Jesus goes, be it done as you desire, and her daughter was healed instantly. This woman's daughter being healed instantly is very similar to how back in chapter 8, we have the woman with the issue of blood who is unclean, right? Due to her issue of blood, she touches Jesus' garments, instantly healed. Jesus looks at her and calls her daughter. Daughter, you're healed. And right here, instantly, this woman's daughter is healed. And I think there's tremendous connection between this story and that one with the woman with the issue of blood. At the end of the day, Jesus lets this woman's faith and her desire set the bar for what he would do. He doesn't go, sorry, honey, you weren't born an Israelite. Sucks for you. He finds more faith outside of Israel than inside. Where you're supposed to find the most faith in the most sacred space of that nation, he's finding the opposite. And this story takes place in Gentile territory, and coincidentally, in the next story, Jesus will feed multitudes. He's healing, he's doing crazy stuff, and he's going to feed multitudes that likely include many Gentiles. He's going to provide bread in the way that technically he's feasting with unclean sinners in chapter 8 or 9, I forget. I think it's chapter 9. And the way he's, offering spiritual bread and spiritually feeding this Canaanite woman. So, in the very next section, this bread that's been offered to one single Gentile woman is multiplied. And it's not spiritual bread, it's physical bread offered to multitudes of Israelites and Gentiles. And Jesus, you might say, is hosting another feast in the wilderness where he multiplies bread once again for the masses. But we need to consider how that miraculous feeding connects to each one of these previous stories. So if you guys didn't know, we actually have a brand new channel called Different Bible Study. We've moved our Thursday studies over there. We're going through Genesis, starting from the very beginning. It's been awesome so far, so make sure you go subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss those teachings, because they complement the teachings we do here in Matthew. There's more I'm going to share on a follow-up teaching on the exclusive video section of our website for monthly supporters. In that video, we'll walk through application, reflect on this wisdom. And so if you're a monthly supporter, go check that out. If you're not, you can become one today. And if you'd rather just skip that teaching, download my sermon notes as a monthly supporter. You have access to all of my sermon notes. Just my way of saying thank you. And then the last thing is this. Make sure you guys follow our reading plan, which you can find every week on the homepage of our website. It changes week to week, so you'll probably want to click the link in this video description. And then join us Thursday nights for our follow-up conversation, our group study together on our Discord server. Like this video and subscribe. And in the next video, we will unpack the feeding of the 4,000. So I'll see you there. Hey, if you're not a monthly supporter yet of this ministry, here's why you'll want to become one today. You get access to exclusive teachings every week. Right now I'm going through Genesis, looking at the Hebrew and drawing out deeper insights. You'll get access to all of my biblical parallel worksheets. And there are other benefits for higher tiers, like unlimited access to all of my sermon notes, free access to paid Bible courses, and even early access to weekly Bible teachings. So go check that out on the website, and thank you for supporting this ministry to help us teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. I'll see you in the next video.